What a change in the weather. Going from the spring of being very hot and very dry to moving on to summer being very wet, cloudy and windy. It's not been a great season for most of our plants on our plots. As you can see behind me, I've got some beautiful sunflowers, which are happily being pollinated by the local wildlife, all the bees and the different hoverflies and things like that. But I don't know whether you're like me and have noticed a big difference this year on our pollination rates. Things like your beans and things like that that heavily rely off insect pollination have been very slow to do so this year. There's several different types of pollination that plants can use to create those fruits or vegetables. There's insect pollination, which uses the local wildlife to pollinate so it can actually produce the fruits or the vegetables. There's wind pollination. This is what corn does. Corn produces the male flowers on the top and it gets blown about by the wind, scattering onto the lower cobs below. And then of course you've got different ones like where you have to hand pollinate the plants with either a paintbrush or a male flower onto a female flower. I could go into much more depth about pollination and the science all behind it, but I want to keep it very simple. This year, I'm not going to lie, I've had a real lack of pollinators. We have found the good old bumblebees having a good rummage through some of our squash and courgette plants. And we have seen some other insects going around pollinating some of our plants. But I've noticed a dramatic difference in a lot of the flying insects that are used to pollinate our plants this year. And this got me thinking, are you suffering the same? Have you got something that you have grown for a long time and this year you've actually struggled to get pollinated? I'd like to know your answers in the comments below. I'm curious to see whether it is just weather related because of the change in the weather being so hot and then going on to being so damp and wet, whether there is an impact in our local insects that are nature's way of pollinating our plants. There are many plants on our plots that need to be pollinated in some form, and just a few are your broad beans, your French or dwarf beans, your peas, your courgettes and your squashes, just to name a few. Now all mine actually started quite late in the season this year, and my courgette plants must have took a good month of growing to actually start getting pollinated. And I'm curious to know if this is a widespread problem. I don't use any pesticides or anything like that on this plot, but I think each to their own. But I'm wondering whether it's the weather patterns or whether it's pesticide damage that has caused such a lack in flying pollinators. I know at the beginning of the year, my fruit trees didn't get pollinated at all. Now it was quite early on in the season when you do get those flowers come out for your fruit trees in general. But I have nothing on any of my trees again this year. But to be honest, it was quite cold at that time of year, and the northeasterly wind that we had really did keep the actual average temperature down. And talking of rain, it is actually starting to rain now. But we do need it. I'm not going to begrudge a bit of rain. Now my runner beans have been really strange this year. The flowers have been out for several weeks now, and the beans just had not started to set at all. Well, lo and behold, I've come down today and I've actually started to get some beans showing. Now this took so long for this to actually get pollinated. And I actually do think that it may be a lack of pollinators this year. Now, I've got multiple of these plants through the allotment, but it's these two here and the one over here which is doing much better and a much stronger growth. Next year I've got some really good ideas for some climbing frames and things for all my tall beans. While my squashes have finally been pollinated and I'm now starting to have plenty of fruits on there, it took a long time to actually get any to get pollinated. And even these courgettes that I've got growing here, I must have picked off about 20 fruits that had failed to be pollinated before I even started getting any at all that had actually been pollinated. And I think this kind of thing does catch out a lot of new growers, knowing when something has been pollinated and when something hasn't. The key tale is normally you'll see a fruit that starts going mushy on the end, or there's a change in colour or shape or something like that. And in general that means it actually hasn't been pollinated. But thankfully it actually has picked up. It's just been very slow. So don't give up hope when it comes to lack of pollination, because what you will find, even if it is the local pollinators are a little bit slow to pollinate this year, eventually it will. It will just take a little bit longer. But looking at my crops now, they have actually in general been pollinated just a little bit later than it would have been normally. So just don't give up hope, guys. Keep your area clean, weed free as much as possible, water and feed. All this helps produce some really good crops. But this July, it really has been, well, it's been really up and down with the weather, and you really don't know what you're going to get. But I am curious, guys. Please leave a comment below. I am really curious about this, about pollination and how it's actually being affected regionally, and whether it is lack of pollinators or whether it is poor seeds, poor plants, bad weather, or whether it is the insects. Give us your opinions. I'd like to learn a little bit more about this. I just wanted to do this little video just to find out a little bit more information about how you guys are actually growing and what issues you've actually had.